How do you lead inclusively? That simple question is not that easy to answer. And today's guest will give us an outlook on how we can do that, not only theoretically, but also practically. Hi, my name is Ingo Raut. Welcome to the School of Becoming. In this series, we focus on activating inclusion. And I had the pleasure to work with people like today's guest that supported the idea in curating that program. And we collaborated with Managed Magazine to bring you these sessions on activating inclusion. With that, I want to welcome today's guest, Numan Najraf, who is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Rotman School of Management, University of Toronto, where he also works as a professor teaching on diversity and inclusion. Numan is not only knowledgeable about diversity and inclusion, but seeing him and having worked with him at the University of Toronto really showed me what diversity and inclusion means in action. With that, welcome, Numan.
So I want to thank Ingo Raut, who is a friend, a colleague, a mentor to me, someone that I really respect and really value for his entrepreneurship, for his commitment to learning. And I would say that this series is evidence of that. Ingo is someone who takes feedback to heart. And I want to celebrate you, Ingo, for recognizing that not only that leadership work is people work, that if we are not leading across differences, we're not actually being committed leaders in the fullest sense of the word. I want to begin by acknowledging the land on which the University of Toronto operates. This is physically where I am. This land is, has been, always shall be, sacred land for Indigenous First Nations, to the Huron-Wendat, to the Seneca, and most recently to the Mississaugas of New Credit. Now, I say this land acknowledgement not simply because it's one of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but actually for a more fundamental reason than that. And that reason is this. You see, for me, universities only exist for two reasons. Reason number one is knowledge creation. And reason number two is knowledge mobilization. And I don't think we can speak adequately either of knowledge creation or of knowledge mobilization unless and until we acknowledge the knowledge systems of the ones who've come before us. I urge you, as I urge myself every week, to ask this question and to answer it honestly, which is, how might you, through the choices that you make, either enable or impede reconciliation? To me, that's an important conversation that goes beyond the theoretical. To me, it's important for us to actually really recognize that all of us have a role in doing this. All right. I want to say to you that the title is a little bit puzzling to some of you, which is Emancipatory Leadership. All right, so what are we talking about? First and foremost, I want to say, I recognize the context in which we're living today. So we're not actually sure if we're living at work or working from home. So for those of you who are actually here and you have other obligations and you have to step away before the session's done, I recognize you have multiple obligations on your time. So feel free to step out, feel free to step away. But Ingo, I know, would value your feedback. So please do give us feedback as we engage in the process. So emancipatory leadership, where does it begin? Emancipatory leadership to me is a fancy schmancy word that captures two phenomena in one. The first phenomenon is this, that leadership work is people work. And if you can't love them, you can't lead them. Asterisk. One more time. That leadership work is people work. And if you can't love them, you can't lead them. Asterisk. So what's the asterisk? The asterisk is this. It's not that you have to love everyone that you lead, but in everyone that we lead, there must be something that we love to see grow and to develop. And so what gets in the way of that, of our ability to grow and to develop people, is that they often fall outside of this band that I call the band of optimal distinctiveness. So they're a little bit too out there for us. And so what we do is we kind of write them off. On that front, I want to quote the US president. I know. Not the current one that was like way back. Abraham Lincoln said the following. He said, "I don't like that man, said Abe Lincoln. And then right after that, he said, I must get to know him better. To me, emancipatory leaders are individuals who, when they actually have a certain sense that, that person is kind of rubbing me a certain way, they actually lean into where that feeling is coming from. What is it about Ingo? What is it about Numan? What's it about Asim? What is it about Fazila or Marcel that is making me feel a little bit at odds? And instead of reverting back to their comfort zones, they actually lean in the opposite direction of saying, let me actually embrace that discomfort, because they understand that learning and discomfort are linked. We can only learn when we abandon our comfort zones. The other part of emancipatory leadership is this, that leaders do great things for themselves and their organizations, not simply because they don't have strong preferences, biases. Watch my language here. To me, strong preferences, biases are exactly the same. So leaders do great things for themselves and others, not because they do not have strong preferences, biases, but despite them. Imagine how much more actualized, impactful, and engaged they might be if, one, they knew what these strong preferences, biases were, two, had some tools to actually mitigate for their impact, and three, could create a culture in which these would take root. That's a starting point for our conversation. I want to say to you unequivocally that today, leadership is in a crisis of credibility. Locally, municipally, provincially, nationally, internationally, we have a consistent call that says we need to see changes. We demand greater accountability, respect, and engagement. This, by the way, is not stock photography. This is a picture taken by one of my colleagues, Anna Sophia Barrows, of one of the recent Black Lives Matter protests right here in Toronto, making its way across Bay Street over to the police headquarters in Toronto. So what is this crisis of credibility? It comes from a place of people not feeling that they are represented in the models of leadership that have currency. My colleague and friend, Gian Piero Petrieri at INSEAD, says the following. He says, leaders are able to tell a story of people at a particular moment in time. For leaders to restore leadership to its rightful place of credibility, they will have to do that. They will have to actually ask the question, whose stories aren't showing up in the common parlance? I want to say to you that any chance that I get, I like to quote Jimmy Baldwin, who Malcolm X referred to as the poet of the revolution. He said, look, there are no clear vistas. The road that seems to pull one forward into the future is also pulling one backward into the past. We began this conversation with a land acknowledgement. I want to say to you that as people living on Turtle Island, if we don't actually recognize the erasure of indigenous cultures and languages, we cannot talk about reconciliation. At John Crouch, who was an educator in my course last Friday, he said, before reconciliation, we must speak about conciliation. I want to get super practical with you. I want to say to you that instead of being drowned in the sentiments of guilt and shame, leaders, for them to really make a difference, have to ask this question, right? And that was this. What is the impact that I'm seeking? So we as leaders need to insist on what is the impact. Asim mentioned in his introduction that he's part of an organization that is looking to do work. Ask yourself the question, what are the unique things about my own experiences that I want to bring into this? And then I'm going to say something that's super provocative, so wait for it. I'm not just talking about your successes. I'm also talking about your failures. I'm talking about the ways in which we may have been complicit, right? In the ways in which certain systemic and other forms of exclusion have made others feel othered. Here's an example of this. This is W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, the first African-American to actually earn a doctorate from Harvard University. And also, by the way, the first African-American to be president at Harvard University. And this is what he had to say about America's preeminent institution of higher learning. I was in Harvard, not of it. I need 3 people to tell me what they hear in this conversation, in this quote. I can see your names, I can call you out, but if you want to just put your hands up and say, here's what I hear. Who wants to start? Okay, Edward said exclusivity. Thank you. 2 more. What do you hear? I was in Harvard, not of it. Yeah, belonging or lack thereof. Thank you, Awesome. Not the product. His part of the institution, but didn't feel like he belonged. Not a product. Sorry, he was part of the institution, but not a product of it. Not the product of Harvard. Diversity, not inclusion, not belonging. Thank you, Marcel. He didn't feel a sense of belonging, says Aaron. Separation, uninvolved, didn't feel like he belongs, says Anna Perez. I would say to you, the thing that I hear as a leadership guy is lament. And lament is probably the saddest thing you can hear in a statement as a leader. Because lament is all about what might have been. You see, this is the metric for me around emancipatory leadership. To what extent are we actually not just putting people together in boxes called organizational charts, but giving them the agency that they need to fully be engaged in the work day to day? How do we do that? Well, the starting point is this. We must acknowledge, address, and overcome barriers to inclusion. Acknowledge. Acknowledge that, in fact, we have barriers. Systemic, structural, and sometimes strategic. Address them, identify them, and say, how do we think about ways in which we can mitigate their impact? And overcome these barriers by saying, what choices can I make? So one of the things I haven't said yet that I want to make very clear, to me, leadership is not positional. Any person who has a decision right is a leader. So what's the first decision that we make every single day? How do we show up? And the second part of this is to leverage our privileges in service of this important leadership outcome. You see, my colleague and friend, Dolly Chugg at Stern at NYU says the following. She says, it is precisely where we have privileges that we have blind spots. So I'm not here to make you feel bad for your privileges or to apologize for them or return them back at the bank, but I am here to say something. Unrecognized privilege leads to unrecognized and unaccounted for blind spots. I'll give you my own example. So I have a ton of academic privilege. So when I have a nephew or niece who says, oh my gosh, I'm really struggling with my undergrad, I'm like, dude, it's your undergrad. Go to a few classes, skip a few classes, have a good time, do that for, 12 weeks to 14 weeks. That's one semester. Do that for 8 terms and you've got your undergrad. Come on. How difficult could that be? Can you name what forms of privilege are showing up in that statement by me? That dismissive statement by me? What's happening there in Professor Newman-Ashraf's parlance? Put it out there, please, in the chat. What forms of privilege are showing up? Economic, thank you. The fact that I don't have to worry about the repercussions of not being able to complete a degree. Thanks, Christine. Educational, said Laura. Yeah, education has so many levels. Like, I know exactly what the outcomes are. I know exactly what it takes to ace an exam. I know exactly how to complete my credits. I know exactly who to talk to if I need assistance. Marcel's cognitive neurology, for sure, memory, study habits, smarts, having the knowledge, so knowing how to learn. And something else. Having the self-esteem to feel like I belong. Networks. Thank you, Aaron. All right, personal experiences. Absolutely. How about the fact that I am the child of educators? My mother's a teacher. My dad's an investment banker. I mean, these things perpetuate themselves in very powerful yet subliminal ways. No one ever said, like growing up, no one ever said to me, are you going to go to college or university? They always asked me, which programs were you applying to? What's the difference? Thank you, Christine. Social norms. What's the difference? Not whether you're going to college or university, but which programs will you be applying to? Huge expectations, right? Both ways. So expectations of excellence, but also expectations of performance. Tacit in all of this is that somehow I could do it. Okay. This is the conversation I want to have with you. We can't talk about inclusion. We can't talk about meaningful emancipatory leadership unless we talk about systems, structures, and sustainable strategy. A lot of folks are talking about inclusion as if it's just a series of programs. I want to say to you, as I think about my own faculty, I think about my own alma mater, the University of Toronto, I worry about the glaring absence of Black and Indigenous students and members of faculty. Because we need to challenge the systemic, structural, and lack of sustainable strategy around making those members of our communities feel like they belong. If you take nothing away from our conversation today, take this away. The lack of analysis at the systems, structural, and sustainable strategy level is going to always reduce the conversation of inclusion into programs here and programs there. To me, that's a fail. Here's a good example. I had to put up my man Masai Ujiri, despite the fact that we didn't get as far as we wanted to this year, right? Says this: the word leader appeared in scouting reports 7.5 times per 10,000 words for white athletes and 3.4 times for Black athletes. Now, this is in a sphere within society in which traditionally in basketball, Black athletes dominate. Look at the stat for a reason. For a second, people. How do you make sense of this? I want to hear 5 people's thoughts. What happens when cognitively, subconsciously, we define leadership a certain way? Yeah, it's systemic, for sure. It's a blind spot of what a leader looks like, feels like. We'll limit the playing field, for sure. Anyone here know about the Rooney Rules? So the Rooney Rules were actually put in play, pardon that pun, in the NFL, the National Football League. And the Rooney Rules hold that no search for a coach in the NFL can proceed unless you have at least 2 African-American candidates on the slate. Now, most people think those are quotas. Actually, they're not quotas. They're targets. And the reason I say that is the moment that the Rooney Rules went into play, the nature of assistant coaches and full-time coaches in the NFL started to change. Did all of a sudden general managers and owners of football teams in the NFL find the equity lens that was in their workout gear? No. That which gets measured gets done. And this is why the S piece is so important. It is important for us to say, besides just blaming the pipeline, what are some structural ways in which we define what meaningful leadership looks like? And that redefinition requires for us to be daring, to dare to be powerful. Audrey Lorde reminds us, when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I'm afraid. You see, Here's a funny thing. Whether we use our agency or not, we have it. I'm arguing with you this morning or afternoon that we need to use our agency in direct service of the vision for a more inclusive, engaging, and equitable society. Well, that requires for us then to understand that our identities are super complex. They're not just defined by one or two things. They're defined by a range of things. I call them vectors of identity. So what's the cool thing about this vector of identity argument? It's this. The very basis on which we feel excluded, that dimension of our identity balloons and takes over the rest of our sense of self. So play along with me, please. Can you think about a situation where you had an encounter with someone and you said something and all of a sudden you felt that chill? You felt like an ironclad wall descended between you and the other person. And very quickly you did what most of us do, which is we turn into polite conversation about the weather and we ended it. Has that ever happened to you or just me and my in-laws? What's happened to you? Okay. Have you ever thought about why? So think about the following thing. What might we have triggered in that conversation around one of these identities that actually really made the person feel super, super small? I want to say to you that I see this happening all the time, like on a daily basis. I was invited by one of the most important law firms in Canada. They're a patent law firm, global actually. And I was invited by their board to come and talk to them. It was in Montreal. We had a board meeting. In the morning, they were doing some comp discussions. They asked me to leave the room. I left the room. It was just the managing partners of the various locations in the room. And I'm standing outside the ballroom. Security is there because, it's like one of those things. And someone's trying to get in and security says, we don't need IT support. And they grab somebody. And the person says, I'm not IT support. I'm the managing partner of the Vancouver office. So that moment in time, they just made the assumption, East Asian person walking in with a briefcase, probably IT support. But that moment in time, if you look at the identity matrix that I have in front of us, that race thing absolutely ballooned. And I'm sure they had a really good, fun conversation about compensation. I want to talk to you about, because many of you will say, well, that's just a microaggression. That's a pretty macroaggression. That's one. But I want to take this microaggression thing and flip it on its head. I want to talk to you as leaders around the fact that we have choices that we have to make daily. And the choices require for us to decide where we put our chips at the level of organizational culture. And I want you to think about this spectrum that I presented to you as a tool, as an audit tool, and ask this question: where are we as an organization? From intolerance to tolerance to civility to affirmation to engagement. So what's the difference? You see, intolerance only has one model of leadership and no more. Mere tolerance in leadership is about this. It's like holding your nose and saying, I don't like you, but I'll put up with you. It's me holding my nose and saying, I don't like you, but I will put up with you. Now ask yourself the question, do you really want to be just merely tolerated within an organization? I don't. But the number of corporations that call me and say, Newmont, can you help us please with a plan for greater tolerance? I'm like, no. you've got the wrong guy. Next comes civility. And civility is about ways in which we can create conditions in which people's sense of self matters. Affirmation is the next stop, in which you feel affirmed for who you are in a meaningful way. Meaningful by whose standard? Still by the standards of the firm. The golden standard, though, the gold standard, is engagement. You see, engagement presumes the following: that systems, structures, and strategy were put together absent a view that the demographic shifts that have actually taken place and the needs and aspirations of people have shifted over time. So to me, I think an emancipatory leader has a mindset that says, I have a range of choices around the kind of culture that I enable. So here's my other pro tip for you. The behavior that we walk past is a culture that we enable. One more time. The very behavior that we walk past is the culture that we enable. So in my books, we don't actually have room for passive recipients of organizational culture. We need to embrace this idea that the way that we're conditioned to see the world in our own culture seems so completely obvious and commonplace that it is difficult to imagine another culture might do things differently. Now, the funny thing about this quote by Erin Meyer is that she's speaking about national cultures, but I think of it as being equally applicable in the context of organizational cultures. She says it's only when you start to identify what is typical in your culture, but different from others, that you can begin to open a dialogue about sharing, learning, and ultimately understanding. So what's cool about fora like this one, thank you again, Ingo, for putting us together, is you can begin to compare notes. To say what's happening in healthcare versus what's happening in academia, to what's happening in the CPG sector, to what's happening in consulting, to seeing what's happening in oil and gas. And unless we have a comparative lens, all this stuff kind of just feels rote. This is the model I want to share with you, which I call cultural fluency. I hate the term cultural sensitivity. I just hate it. Because to me, it's not about being more sensitive. It's not. I don't want your sensitivity. I don't. You can keep it. You know, that and $4.50 will get you a coffee from Starbucks, right? And I think what's really important is to understand that it begins with awareness. It begins with awareness of where we have been. Next, it goes to understanding that people's cultures are distinct and whole to them, irrespective of whether or not they're meaningful to you or to me. The layer above that is to develop the skill to navigate across those differences. Now, even at the level of navigation, there isn't this idea of ethnocentrism, that somehow ours is superior. At the top of that sits this notion of fluency. So why do I love fluency? I also don't love, by the way, cultural competence. Because think about it for a second. What's the opposite of competence? Heck, it's incompetence. And to me, that sounds super colonial. Here we are at the summit of cultural competence. All of you down there are so incompetent. I'm not down with that. Pat me on the back because I'm just so fly. Nonsense. So cultural fluency to me picks up on the metaphor of language. And I used to say that it begins with language acquisition. Until I was actually teaching a bunch of professors. And one of them raised their hands. And they said, Professor? I said, yes, Professor. And she said, I actually teach language acquisition. I said, great. And she said, language acquisition does not begin with the acquisition of vocabulary. She said, language acquisition begins with, wait for it, attachment. We all speak the languages of individuals with whom we have attachment. So think about this. Our parents, our grandparents, our relatives, our caregivers. Heck, if you've been in a cross-cultural relationship, you pick up, words to impress the in-laws, or I call them outlaws until they become your in-laws, right? So you can actually have some currency with them. It begins with attachment. I want to go back to something I said earlier on. Leadership work is people work. If you can't love them, you can't lead them. Cultural fluency likewise begins with an attachment to people. It begins with an understanding that culture is whole and meaningful and complete to them. But like in all language systems, if you don't use them, you lose them. So here's the funny part. While we're talking about this in 2020, this notion is not actually that new. This is Hippocrates. This was advice that he was giving his medical students way back. What's the advice? He said, observe the nature of each country. Their diet, customs, the age of the patient, speech, manners, fashion, even their silence. He said his, I'm making it there. One must study all these signs and analyze what they portend. When we deal with people, there are 3 rules, and design teaches us this. Observe, inquire, and engage. Observe, right? It begins with observation. Inquire. Tell me your story. Tell me more. And engage. How might we connect, find common cause, and deliver? To me, this is one of my favorite colleagues. Her name is Angela Duckworth. She's now at the Wharton School of Business. And she's got a wonderful book called Grit. And Angela reminds us that passion for your work is a little bit of discovery, followed by a lot of development, and then a lifetime of deepening. You can apply this to a language. You can apply this to a sport. You can apply this to anything that you're passionate about. But you can also apply this to the work of justice, of equity, of engagement. Let this be the beginning of our conversation and not the end. Because to me, fundamentally, where we have to go in this conversation, and promise us at the end, is this. Ingo, this is a new model I discovered in honor of you and sharing with you, because you were at the very beginning of this model that I was putting together. So here it is. I call this the avocado when I'm hungry. When I'm not hungry, I call this peacock feather. So emancipatory leaders begin at the very center of this peacock's feather. They ask this question: what's my aspiration? How do I want to dent the universe? How do I want to make a difference in the world? That's our aspiration. Next, they ask the question, what capacity do I need to build? So even in the conversations we've had thus far, we have to have the capacity of being actively engaged and listening, observing, inquiring, of being reflective practitioners. I've got these journals and notes that I take every single day that keep me honest. Feedback, those are feedback forms on my door. Those are capacities that we have to build and reinforce. See, the opportunity thing, it's super slippery. Because sometimes we think about what opportunities could I have in the future? That's just hogwash. I want us to say what opportunities exist right under our noses. What opportunities surround us? And lastly, what is the contribution that I want to make as a leader? Contribution not only to the ones who look like me, who feel like me, and who sound like me, but to the ones who are looking to us for impact. What can you do? Keep a notebook. I really mean this. This is sound advice from Jack London, the writer. Travel with it, eat with it, sleep with it, slap it into every stray thought that fluttered into your brain. Cheap paper is less perishable than gray matter, and lead pencil markings endure far longer than memory. I thank you for your kindness, for your engagement, and for your presence. Ingo, over to you.
I hope you enjoyed this session with Professor Numan Ajraf. If you want to know more now, Numan, check out the link in the show notes below. To find out about our program and upcoming classes, make sure to check out schoolofbecoming.org.